Welcome to the School Sucks Project, a podcast, YouTube channel, and online community dedicated to personal growth and intellectual self-defense.
We promote learning alternatives, home education, critical thinking, peaceful parenting, organization and productivity, and better communication strategies.
Please remember to visit schoolsucksproject.com to get comprehensive show notes, relevant links,
or to just leave comments.
Follow us on Twitter at SchoolSucksShow. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, username School Sucks Podcast, and get involved in our Facebook group. Just search for School Sucks Project.
Steve, welcome back to School Sucks for the final installment in our Principles of Learning Anything series.
It's great to be with you again.
I'm excited about this one.
Yes, it's certainly one that might be the most important out of all of them.
So the phrase is self-explanatory. We will go into some detail, but tell me why this was an important one for you to add to the list.
So learning incorporates many parts. You have the actual information input into your brain, but there's also an internal mindset that you have to have that is absolutely essential. And I kind of learned the hard way in my own process of learning over the years that if you have the wrong mindset, it really doesn't matter what information you're being fed. You're not going to be actually learning. You're not going to actually be in the process of developing competence.
Do you think we start with the wrong mindset, like as a default almost?
Yes, I do. And that's where this particular principle comes into play. Embracing your own incompetence. Specifically, it's about coming to grips with your own ego and having a clear understanding of what failure is. I think by default, just in the process of growing up, everybody is very scared of failure, and almost everybody has ego problems. I mean, that's just kind of a part of human life. But both of those things are really toxic if your end goal is to learn something.
Absolutely. So it's more emotional than intellectual at the beginning, huh?
Yes, I suppose you could say that.
All right. So what do you think it is about ego? Like, we want to just demonstrate that we are competent in something. We want to show off. And I'm kind of interested in where you think that comes from.
Yes. So those are two very different questions.
Okay.
One, I think ego is about valuing appearance more than reality. It's about giving the appearance of knowledge and competence and mastery and expertise and coolness, right? Looking cool in regards to your peers and the groups that you're hanging around versus actually understanding what you're talking about, actually having competence of whatever you claim to have competence about. The reason it's so devilish is because it's a methodological error. If you have ego issues, then it literally affects the entire process of learning. Every step in the learning process is going to have this methodological error, which makes it very counterproductive towards the process of learning. Now, the other part of the question is where it comes from, and I mean, I don't really know. My totally unsatisfactory and shallow answer is to say it's human nature. But where that comes from, I'm not sure.
I don't know. I think it probably is reinforced by the schooling experience, which you fortunately escaped. It is embarrassing to get called on in 7th grade math class when it becomes abundantly clear that you're bored and you haven't been paying attention for God knows how long. I have memories like that where you don't want to look like a fool, right, basically. But there's also a kind of flexing, you know, and it almost is, it goes back to like the sophists in ancient Greece, right? Where it's not so much, it's not even really important if you actually know what you're talking about or if you're making sound arguments. You just have to beat the other person. We see that plenty in, you know, the political debates that have been available to watch on television and YouTube. But we also see that in the political discussions that we have with people who do not share our views in real life. So that takes us back to your college years, I guess we could say, where you're studying political science. Did you feel when you first started engaging with people on the, political or philosophical matters that ego was in the way for you? And a follow-up question would be, how did you overcome that?
It certainly was, and it certainly is. I don't think I've reached the point of fully overcoming ego issues. My particular story was a bit unique just because of the upbringing being homeschooled, that I was always seen as the outsider, as the weird one. So I had developed a pretty thick skin up to that point. But when you go into college, and I started young, and everybody's like, who is this guy? And he keeps saying all these things that nobody else agrees with. It wasn't as much like, oh, I have to prove my intellectual fortitude with them. It was more, I don't know, selfish than that. It was more, oh, these people really don't know what they're talking about. It was more, I got more angry than I did defensive. But I think that was just more of my upbringing, always being the outsider. And that's certainly in the work that I'm doing now. A lot of my work in philosophy runs very, very directly counter to what people have been taught for the last century in various fields. And so, like we were talking about in the last video, I have kind of gotten to the point now where I enjoy people's mockery. I enjoy the hatred that I get, but I don't think it's necessarily a function of ego as much as it is, I've been in this position so many times. It's kind of like reading off a script. I already know what's happening. A lot of times I can make people's ad hominems for them.
Indeed. And what do you do with that? How do you, maybe an example or two of some of the mockery that you've received, I guess probably through your writing or through YouTube, and how do you make it useful to yourself, or what do you do with it?
Yeah, so there's lots to choose from. Probably the most hatred that I get, right, is between the piece on quantum physics and the work on mathematics. And usually what it comes down to is people say, oh, you are such a buffoon that you're confused about these very basic concepts. And sometimes, well, often actually, what people will say is, your ideas are so bad that I can't even engage with them. I'll be wallowing in the mud with the pigs if I engage you in what you're claiming. And this is actually something directly that we'll talk about more in this, but there's one of two possible options if you don't withdraw and start becoming self-conscious and you want to engage people like this. There's two possible options that I see at taking. One is you say, look, I may be wrong. That's fine. I'm excited about the idea of being wrong about the foundations. In fact, this is great. Like if somebody is saying I'm wrong about the basics, please tell me where did I go wrong? And one of two things will happen. One, you'll learn, which is great. Like if after all this time I have been the one conceiving of infinite sets incorrectly, that would be fantastic. It would make my year. I'd be like, oh, great. Okay, so now I'm brought into the fold. Now I understand why the last century of mathematics was not built on this ridiculous foundation. Great, you've done me a favor. The other possibility, which is usually more common, is that the other person will learn. Because in most people's process of learning and upbringing, if they're to the point where they are disparaging and dismissing you for saying radical things, it's usually a function of them not understanding. So they think, for example, people that think that if you disagree with the foundations of set theory, it must be that you don't understand them. And if you say, hey, look, teach me, please tell me where I went awry, then a lot of times you can engage with them and be like, hey, look, I realize you say this, but now I say this. You've probably never heard this objection, but this is why I believe what I believe. And then they're oftentimes the one that go, oh. So,
well, yeah. Yeah, and I find that when people say, I won't even dignify that with time or a response, those are usually people who are showing you they're not really fully comfortable with what they believe.
Yes, it's also reflective of somebody's lack of embracing the learning process. Because, like we were saying last time, the healthy relationship between student and teacher is to view it as peers. That there's actually two learners, one learner who's just farther along the process. And if that's the truth of the circumstance, then it doesn't make sense to turn around at somebody who doesn't understand as much as you and disparage them and say, you are such an idiot for being back there. I can't believe you would say these idiotic things. So usually that's reflective of, okay, these people aren't actually engaged in the learning process, which probably means I need to take their insults with a little grain of salt.
Yeah, it really doesn't ever seem like they can shame you into agreeing with them.
Right.
Right. And I think a lot of people, who come from, our philosophical vantage point have that same problem. I know I certainly tried that strategy for a long time. And you get too far ahead of the people who you want to be your students, and you lose patience for them. I think that happens as well.
Certainly.
Especially when you roll in a bunch of moral arguments about voting or war or taxes, you know, because it's like, you are the reason why, you know, statist, that I have to endure so much pain. Yeah, so that can quickly get messy. But I wanted to ask you too, can you give an example or two of situations that you walked away from, like conversations or debates, where you felt like you met your match in the world of ideas and were better off for it?
Yes. So I'll give you one. The most recent example, I was talking with a friend about abortion. And for many, many years, I thought that the case for abortion was pretty clear. If it's the case, well, I suppose you could say the entire abortion debate comes down to one question, I thought. Is it true that the conceived egg is a human being? If it is, it doesn't actually matter the circumstances in which that conception happened. That is an individual human being who should not be actively killed.
Right.
I thought that was pretty clear. And then I was talking with a friend about this, and he said, well, hang on a second. You have two sets of rights involved. You have the right of the mother. You have the right of the human being. Yes, I agree with that. And he gave a thought experiment. He said, well, I don't think this was original, but he said, look, imagine a circumstance in which you woke up one day and somebody had a medical tubes that were going into your stomach, into your heart, and into them. So you were tied together. You just woke up. You didn't mean for that to be the case. It just happened. Now, as a direct result of that, this other person is living. Were these tubes cut, that person would die. And so the question is this: can you cut the tubes? Right? You weren't responsible for having these tubes in the first place. Yes, it's another individual human being, but you're also a human being, and that person is essentially using your resources without your permission, without your approval, without your consent. That seems like a problem. And there's actually really good resolution here, which I won't necessarily go into, and it's what Walter Block calls evictionism. He makes a very coherent case for it's kind of pro-life, and it's kind of pro-choice at the same time, and it tries to avoid conflicts of rights between the mother and the child. So that was something that I walked away from. I thought, that's a pretty damn good point. I actually had an issue in my conceiving of this topic that I wasn't even aware of. I thought it was all tied up, and it wasn't. And then it was one conversation, and I changed my mind because it was a pretty clear case.
Interesting. Yeah, Rothbard talked about that too, didn't he? Like, if we establish that this is a human being, there's this question of, does one human being have the right to live at the expense or using the resources of another person who does not want to share?
Right, and there's a difference between, and this is where Walter Block's evictionism comes in. He said there's a difference between ending the life and evicting the life. So you may have a right, for example, to get to evict the 2-month-old child from your abdomen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right to sever its spine and take it out in pieces.
Yeah, I understand that. So you walked away from that interaction with that person with a little bit of pause then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was excited. Just because this is an area philosophy is just something I've been in for so many years. Usually it's not the case that something I think is tied up nicely is completely wrong, and then much less completely wrong, and then I have a logically consistent resolution to that issue. So it was a wonderful conversation. It was a wonderful experience.
All right. Well, calling it wonderful, I think, takes us to what is really the cornerstone of this principle. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is really, really, really important, is embracing a kind of adversity, especially when it's just outright failure. Right? So you experience a kind of intellectual adversity in this challenge, or by feeling, okay, well, maybe it's not back to the drawing board, but maybe there's more here for me to think about than I originally realized. That experience that we have time and time again with so many different things. So in, the embrace of your incompetence, your relationship with failure is incredibly, incredibly important to really, really make the most use of this principle in your learning experience.
Yes, it is paramount. And the reason is this. Failure equals feedback. That is something that everybody should have tattooed on their foreheads all the time. Failure equals feedback. Mm-hmm. So if your ultimate goal is to learn something, you need to gain a lot of information about what is true, what is not true, right? If you're trying to learn something in the martial arts, you need to know what is true, what is not true, so that you could avoid getting punched in the head. If you're trying to learn economics, you need to learn what is true, what is not true. An essential part of the process of learning about what is true is learning about what is not true. Right. When you fail, it is a direct insight into the truth. You get this special direct insight into reality that's like, oh, demonstrably, this is not true. Take that off the plate. Take that off the table. It is now no longer true. Therefore, your list of possible truths is that much smaller. It's the process of elimination in the process of learning. It is absolutely paramount.
The failure is information, essentially.
Failure, that's all it is. And this is entirely a mindset shift. It's not, oh, failure is something that has to be avoided, it's something that I'm self-conscious about. Failure is just a word that we use to describe one area of feedback. That's all it is. It's just, this is not the case. Over the chessboard, when you're playing a chess game and you fail, it actually by itself, if you don't bring any of your own self-consciousness to the table, all it is a resolution to a puzzle. It's just an explanation right there. Oh, look, this is wrong and this is why. That's it. Now, if you can get to that point, it's really hard to do. If you can get to that point where it's like, oh, wow, I'm given the answer in front of me, the process of learning is going to take off exponentially, because now you learn from what you do competently. Now you learn from what you understand. And then when it's demonstrated that you don't understand something, you learn from that as well. It's just learning all around.
Absolutely. Let's put a bookmark in the chess example for a minute, because I want to come back to that and ask you a little bit more about your own experience. But there's a real emotional challenge here, right?
Yes.
With not taking failure too personally, right? It's very easy to turn I did a failure into I am a failure.
Yes.
Right? And it's not like we walk around mumbling that to ourselves, but it's a thought, you know?
Yes.
It's a seed that gets planted. That can grow something very, very nasty, you know, in the mind, that can be really, really pervasive and ultimately stop further action, you know? Like, there's a lot of things that I've tried, and just the initial frustration was not exciting to me. It was not inspiring, and I never went back to it. The drums was an example that I used. I can probably think of 50 related to, what I do now. Just things that were abandoned because of frustration, because it doesn't feel good to fail. So, yeah, go ahead.
That's precisely correct. And there's two things here that we have to unpack. Mm-hmm. One, it is certainly an entirely emotional challenge to overcome the feeling of failure. And second, just the actual truth of the circumstance is that it does not follow to say, I failed at drawing, therefore I am a bad drawer. Mm-hmm. I failed at podcasting, therefore I am a bad podcaster. This is something that is very intimate in our own internal conception of how we think about things. And it is, factually speaking, wrong. And it's really a shame, because it devastates the learning process. If you conclude, I did something wrong, therefore it's reflective of something about me intrinsically, in all of my constituent particles, I am a bad X. Mm-hmm. It's not the case. It's going to prevent you from learning. It's going to weigh on you. It's going to affect your self-image, and it's not true. I talked about this, I think, in the last one, but the most recent example for me, one of the things I'm trying to learn is how to draw better with pencils. I used to be, as of a few months ago, absolutely embarrassingly, miserably terrible a drawer with pencils, like middle school level, laughably bad.
Right.
However, my sister-in-law is an art teacher, and I said, hey, look, I don't know, I'm so incompetent here, but I want to learn, can you help me? She showed me some of the basics, and I've drawn just a few portraits, and they look fantastic. Had I concluded, well, fantastic according to my own measure, but I think they look pretty damn good. Had I concluded for my entire life, I've been miserable at this thing, it must be reflective of me being bad at that intrinsically, I would have never been able to learn what I've learned. And the truth of the circumstance is that the reason I was bad at drawing is because I never learned the basics. I never learned the technique. I never learned the fundamentals. Never did I have that instruction. So it would be silly for me to conclude that it's something intrinsic in my nature that I'm bad at. Rather, fortunately, because this is I have embraced the principles of learning. It's like, oh, look how exciting! I can demonstrate to my sister-in-law how incompetent I am. Like, fix what I'm doing. How do I hold a pencil? Like, tell me these very basic things. And then in a very short period of time, I've been able to really get pretty advanced already in my drawing ability.
Now, when you talk about getting to a point where failure becomes exciting,
Yes.
contrast that to what I was just saying about failure not feeling good and actually leading to a cessation of forward action with a given pursuit. Was it, and I'm interested because of your educational experience, going all the way back to you being very young. Was it always that way for you when you didn't have, all of the strictures or the impositions of the schooling system? Or was there a time, and you can pick, chess, martial arts, piano, or in the world of ideas, again, if you have another example, where failure actually started to become, or not even necessarily failure, but a kind of adversity, a kind of conflict became exciting to you?
Yeah, I struggled with ego massively for probably, I don't know, the first 20 years of my life. So no, this was not something, and it runs in my family too. It's something genetic that my dad was the same way, that ego is a problem, and big time. And specifically failure, and I think, too, there was a little pressure. When I was growing up, I was pretty advanced in the things that I was learning, and there was always a pressure to keep that up. So if there was something that I was failing at or I wasn't doing as great as I was doing all these other things, then I would feel really embarrassed. I wouldn't want to do it. I'd make excuses. Oh, well, I can't do that because, my knee's hurting or whatever it is. I'd make excuses because I didn't want it to seem like there was something I was bad at doing. But it wasn't a sudden realization to have this mindset shift of failure being feedback and being exciting. It was certainly over just the process of learning, maybe, I don't know, starting 6 years ago, something like that, specifically about overcoming ego and understanding failure as feedback. But if there was anything I could really point to as kind of the seed which started this conversion process, it was probably when I was investigating my religious beliefs, which started many, many years ago. And there was a conscious understanding that, okay, this is wrong. I understand my upbringing, conservative Christian radical evangelicalism was wrong, but that's kind of exciting because that means whatever, I care about the truth. The end goal is understanding the truth. And that means I can actually take one of these things off the table. What an interesting principle. And then you investigate something else. You say, well, no, this is something that I find actually wrong, which means that the list of possible rights is that much smaller. And that happened many, many, many years ago. I'll give you one concrete example just right now of this, how this process of elimination has kind of affected my own worldview, and it has to do with the philosophy of mind. What is the relationship between consciousness and physical reality? Is there a distinction between the mental and the physical? And how I've been describing myself for several years now is as a reluctant dualist. The reason for that is what I would say is I don't find the explanation for consciousness within the vocabulary of the physicalist toolbox, as I call it. Just explaining all the phenomena with physical language. Everything is fundamentally reducible and fully explained by bits of matter and energy moving in three-dimensional space. I think that there is an information loss here. If the world that you explain with that set of tools does not explain this other experience that I'm having. And so what I would say is I'm not a physicalist. Well, if you're not a physicalist, that takes off a lot of ideas off the table. But what does that mean? What does that leave you? Well, you have idealism, you have panpsychism, you have dualism, and I'm kind of worried about these other two. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm not necessarily going to take these off the table, but I find what is most compelling, unfortunately, is dualism, that there is this category distinction between mental and physical. And I say that it's a problem, or that I'm a reluctant dualist, because that's a very radical conclusion. You can derive all kinds of shocking potential truths if it's true that there's this distinction between mind and matter. So that's why I have a reluctant dualist entirely as the process of elimination. So if it can be the case that I can rule out idealism and I can rule out panpsychism, I can rule out what's called neutral monism, then yeah, I'm going to be a dualist by default, which is very profound.
Okay, now, even though this next question I'm about to ask might not serve our goals for this conversation, I do know that people will write to me and say, why didn't you ask more when he said this? And so I'm going to ask, what did you feel, or what are you feeling is the disconnect, or what is not being explained in your experience by physicalism in, let's say, 3 to 4 minutes or less?
Oh, sure. I'll just give the nutshell. It's the qualia. It is what things feel like. So, for example, we'll just go straight to the meat of the problem in the brain. Mm-hmm. The physicalist's worldview says that ultimately all phenomena are reducible to physics, to 3 or 4 dimensional phenomena. And here's the problem I have with that. Imagine that you have a complete explanation, physically speaking, for how all the neurons in your brain are firing, how all the chemicals and all the bits of matter are moving around in your brain. Complete, 100%. You know the position of every single bit of matter. Is it the case that there's a full explanation for the phenomena that you're experiencing? Can you fully 100% explain what is going on when we're talking about people and their brains? And I would say, no, you're not. There is the internal experience of what something feels like is not something that is explained by the position of bits of matter in a hunk of meat. There is this qualia, as it's called in philosophy. There is how things actually feel like, which it doesn't matter how deep your physical explanation is, you're never going to get that additional little bit. Okay.
It's just interesting to me. I'm very intrigued because there are a lot of mysteries still in neurology. And in the middle of last year, we even did a series on like adverse childhood experiences and lining up something like internal family systems therapy. Are you familiar with that practice? It used to be discussed fairly frequently on Free Domain Radio. I haven't heard it mentioned in a while. And lining up those kinds of experience with brain scans, right? So seeing these trauma-driven emotional responses to stimuli and how different areas of the brain respond to them was very, very interesting for me. But the whole field of neurology still leaves a lot of questions, right? There's a tremendous amount of mystery there still. So then you add to that these stories, and I'm just kind of trying to stress the point that I'm open-minded about this and intrigued as well. Somebody recovers from some kind of traumatic brain event or traumatic brain injury, and they can suddenly speak fluent Chinese, which was a story that a guest told me about last year, and it seemed to check out. I don't, there's a disconnect there for me, for sure. So, yeah, I'm just intrigued by the whole subject.
I'll just say one more thing. If anybody's interested in this, I wrote a piece called The Case Against Physicalism, which you can find on my site. People might find it more helpful. My approach to this topic is a little bit different than most philosophers' approach. That I kind of make an epistemological case against physicalism, that it's not necessarily about, isn't consciousness this weird thing, which it certainly is. It's more about what is the purpose of theories. Theories explain phenomena that we experience, and if our theories do not fully explain some phenomena we're experiencing, we have to grow the toolbox. We have to grow our concepts. And specifically, critical to thinking about this, and this is something that we could talk all day about, but it's this question: why is it that first-person experience is coupled with third-person phenomena? So why is it that you have all of these bits that are arranged in a particular way? And there's obviously this connection between mental phenomena and what's taking place in your brain, mechanically speaking, in your brain. But why what a remarkable phenomena, a peculiar phenomena to think that you have. If the only tools you're working with, the only concepts you're working with in building this worldview is physical matter, third-person objective phenomena, where do you get first-person subjective experience? It seems like there's a category distinction there, and in fact, I think there is. So this is also sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, that why do you have this apparent distinction between bits of matter and subjective experience, and okay. Not to mention unified subjective experience, meaning not only is there this conscious phenomena that's taking place, it appears to be taking place from our perspectives from a being's standpoint. What is a being? It's very difficult with the physicalist terminology to fully explain why our subjective experience appears to be boundary. There seems to be a me and a not me, that I am something separate from other things. That seems to be a very intuitive idea. And yet, when you're just dealing with physical terminology, that's very, very difficult to explain.
Absolutely. Okay. That makes more sense to me now. And to change directions slightly, in a previous conversation, we talked about speed, right? And you said that really being competent with being able to do something quickly, I guess this would usually be in the realm of music, right? And of course, it could be in art or the world of ideas or even in sports, of course, comes from a very deliberate type of practice that focuses on precision.
Yes.
Above all else. Even if, you're doing it at a frustratingly slow pace. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So now when it comes to execution, we've talked a lot about, the emotional aspects of dealing with failure. But when it actually comes to the doing, how does the, I guess it would be the adjustment to failure show up in the doing? How are you working through the failure to produce better results in the actual action?
It depends on the nature of the failure. So it depends a little bit on the specifics of what we're talking about and what we failed in. Most importantly is the awareness of it, right? You have to be aware of when you are in the midst of failure, of when something is wrong. This is very easy to see in something like chess or the martial arts. In chess, you lose. In the martial arts, you get punched in the face, and you're in the process of losing. It's much more difficult in the world of ideas where you don't have that immediate feedback, though you may have made an error. And what I would say is your analysis of failure is going to change as you become more competent. So, for example, right now, where I am in my chess games, I could give some explanation for why move X was a mistake. I could give some explanation. Guaranteed, somebody who is more advanced than I am will be able to give a more in-depth and a more precise explanation. So even analyzing your own failures is a skill that you can develop, and it depends on the nature of the failure. So in something like music, you can hear it, right? You can hear, I played a wrong note, or I'm playing out of tempo. And all you do is, in something like that, you would stop practicing the things that you're doing perfectly precisely, and you would take that segment, you would take that section in the song, and turn down the tempo more, and play it slowly until it is in tempo, and it is correct, it is precise, and then from there you can play it a little bit faster, and then you can move on to other segments in the piece. You could abstract away and also say this is true in the world of ideas. So if you discover there's something internally incoherent in your political philosophy, right, rather than keep running away with, other conclusions in your philosophy, you have to slow down and say, whoa, okay, hang on. Clearly something is wrong here. And if I get something wrong, it's going to affect all these other areas. I have to take that section of my political philosophy and play it slow, or analyze it piece by piece, concept by concept, until it is as it needs to be.
Indeed. I would like you also to speak to the problem of dealing with a multitude of variables, right? Like in music, say the piano, it shows up and you say, it must have been one of these two fingers, that did the wrong thing. But sometimes, and I'm just thinking a lot of my failures and frustrations in the last couple of years have been related to technical things. And I'm not a tech guy, but there's a lot of technical aspects from everything from, like, where do these weird electronic noises come from to CSS, and everything in between of making this product appear on the internet. So do you have any strategies for analysis when it comes to, okay, something isn't right here, but what could be wrong might be 30 or 40 different things?
Yes. So the only abstract advice that I can give is kind of what we've been talking about in this whole series, is coming back to the basics. Because it's very possible that when you discover failures, you discover errors, it's a you've discovered, in essence, a methodological error or some kind of a foundational error that's resulting in this issue, whatever it is. So in something like CSS, for example, and in computer programming in general, small basic errors in terms like the core of your code is going to affect everything, literally everything. And so if you're just dealing with the symptoms, that's a very dangerous way of going about trying to resolve things. Now you can, it's probably just going to take you a long time. The same would be true in something like, say you're trying to learn about nutrition science, you're trying to learn about health. Well, you have and you've got a stomach ache. Like, oh, well, what's going on? Why is there a failure in my stomach to operate the correct way? Well, there's a billion different explanations that could be true. And if you're going to try to discern and try to have the most compelling theory and explanation for what it is, you have to understand the basics so that you can start ruling things out. Well, could it be this? Could it be this? Oh, well, I had this monstrous pizza last night and I shouldn't have, and now I'm upset. Okay, that's an easy resolution. It could be things that are more difficult, and this is why specifically in the process of failure, you have to get over your ego, and because one of the essential reasons is you have to try to avoid framing errors, like we were talking about before. That if in your analysis of failure and trying to explain failure and adjust to it, you are making a framing error because you don't want to look silly or you want to keep doing what you've been doing and you don't want to incorporate some feedback and you just can't accept that you've been doing something wrong for a long time, you are never going to find the root of the problem. I feel like that's as concrete as I can get because it radically depends on the nature of whatever situation you find yourself in and whatever failure, whether it's a punch in the face or some code that isn't working right.
Right. So here's an example. Several years back, we tried to take this from being an audio presentation only to an audio and video presentation and stream it live. And we'd get the output from the cameras, which were webcams. And I would say, why are my eyes red? Why do I look like a ghost? And, a dozen other questions would come up. Why am I stretched? Why is the orientation of my body and head not correct compared to what I experience in real life? Questions like that. Now, let's just deal with the issue of why am I washed out?
Yeah.
Right. So the camera outputs this image that's washed out, and I say, well, shit, I don't like this. I don't want to look like a ghost on YouTube. Right. I guess this is what the camera puts out. So now let's put this output into, an editor like, I don't know, iMovie or Sony Vegas or whatever I was using at the time. And let's go through and start experimenting with effects that will correct this problem, even though it will degrade the quality of the video because as you apply effects to it, you're kind of screwing with what the original, the quality is. And this could be a whole other endeavor that could be the investment of hours, and then maybe it's a question like, okay, well, maybe my lights are wrong. And then I need to go on eBay and buy a new lighting kit and find out what kind of bulb. Am I using the wrong kind of bulbs? I thought these were the right kind of bulbs. So now I've invested just, picking this number somewhat arbitrarily, but 10 hours. Right? And this extra, unnecessary time investment is a result of ignorance of the basics.
Right.
Because what the problem might have been that started me on this whole unnecessary path was a basic called white balance, right? Yeah. If the camera wasn't white balanced, Yeah,
Right.
I'm either going to look like a ghost, or I'm going to look blue, or I'm going to look red. And that's a problem that I just say, oh, I guess that's what the output is, and I'll figure out how to fix it in post-production. I feel like I've done stuff like that
Yes.
way, way too much. And somebody actually asked me recently if I would participate in like a online seminar in podcasting. And I said, yes. And then I said, uh-oh. You know, I have lists of procedures like I mentioned before, but I really better make sure that I am concrete in the basics of doing this. Because
Yes.
everything was trial and error. Like I said before, I had all this enthusiasm and energy, and all that momentum just carried me into doing this without really having any knowledge of actually how to do it. And, you know, being able to assemble a list of basic principles and basic operational procedures for what I do was something that had to be like backfilled later once the project itself already had all this momentum. So that's the best example I can think of. A lot of time invested unnecessarily because of one fundamental that was not understood or ignored.
It's a fantastic example, and here's something that's very exciting about that. That in the abstract, as you've analyzed it, there was this error that was a function of not understanding the fundamentals. That's just abstraction. That's nothing concrete. When you understand that, you can apply it to everything else that you're trying to do. This is kind of the nature of the principles of learning. That principle that you've just described, or that concept that you've just described, about not making framing errors and how devastating they can be, is one of those essential pieces of the puzzle that literally, though it's abstract, if you understand it and you grasp that, you'll be able to apply it everywhere. And it's like dealing with causes rather than symptoms, or it's broadening your vision to say, okay, hang on, I need to step back here. Might it be, that the problem is something silly, like I got the camera's bunk, or there's this thing called white balancing. I had no idea. Is my screen not representing colors correctly? Like I'm having that trouble with my laptop right now. I'm aware, just because I've been in the world of video production for a bit, that I have a really crappy laptop screen. Now, what I have done in the past, when I was working for organizations that I was putting out content for, is I didn't realize this. It didn't enter my head that different screens have different color temperatures and different, they're structured differently. They represent colors differently. So if I were to try to correct and make a really pretty image on my laptop right now, and then ship it off to a client who has a screen that is more closer to standard, I would be making bad quality content, and I wouldn't even know it. Because if they were to send the file back to me and say, oh, hey, Steve, there's colors. What are you thinking about? This color's terrible. I'd look at it and say, oh, it looks good to me. But it's because my screen is representing the colors wrong. So it's these kind of fundamentals that, gosh, you have to be aware of in the process of learning. Otherwise, you're just going to be wasting an enormous amount of time.
Yeah, that experience and the one that I described as well, or your experience kind of reinforced this for me, made me think about what I've been through more. There seems like there's been a lack of preparation for failure, right? Which comes from obviously a failure to embrace failure.
Yes.
So like I've started, I've started doing things and said, well, I'll figure it out, and then wound up getting frustrated because I wasn't prepared for that. Right. Yeah. How familiar are you with the philosophy of Stoicism? Have you studied that at all?
I have a little bit, and I'm very, very, very sympathetic.
Yeah, I think it has a lot of good principles in it, and one of them is turning adversity into advantage. But a lot of it is also these kind of, envisioning exercises to basically prepare for adversity. And I'm thinking that it's probably a worthwhile practice, both intellectually and emotionally, to think of the ways you could fail, or envision the failures, even if it's not clear, or just experience the experience of failure before you actually start down that road. So it's coming. So you have like the footing to accept it, I think is also a really important thing, because I've lacked that in a lot of pursuits in my life.
Yes, and I honestly think that failure and ego just go hand in hand, because part of the process, I think, of overcoming the ego and overcoming the aversion to failure is about understanding it as clearly as you can. This is something like the Stoic philosophy, that you don't worry about things that you can't control.
Indeed.
If you have to worry about things that you can control. And this is kind of similar. It's just about if you have a clear conception to the Stoic of, the asteroid that's going to hit the Earth, and that is the way that it is, and you clearly understand it, and you can't do anything about it, the idea is, you just have to accept it. That's the way it is, and I'm not going to worry about it. Well, this is the same thing with failure. A clear conception of failure is something that I think is going to naturally resolve a lot of the issues and embarrassment that we have associated with it. Here's kind of another way I like to think about it. That everybody, in order to get to their ultimate mastery of something or understanding of something, they get to Z and they're starting at A. They have to go through B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. until they get to Z. That's a necessary, essential part of the process. You can't get here without going through the steps. So all of these steps are doing things wrong and understanding wrong and doing everything wrong until, after a lot of effort, you get to where you want to be. So if you're at A and you don't know anything, and then you're at B and you know just a teeny tiny bit, but really not anything, you're doing everything wrong, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's just another step of the process. So you go into the dojo, this is an excellent example, right? So you go into the dojo with a decade of martial arts experience, but it's not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you go in there and all the white belts that have been training for 3 months are tapping you out. Great. Mm-hmm. Of course. The reaction isn't, oh gosh, that's so embarrassing. Oh, I can't show my face. Like, oh, this is terrible. I'm going to forget the martial arts. It's, of course, I'm at A. I'm at B. And the other part of this is this results in self-acceptance because it's like, yeah, naturally I'm going to be bad at stuff until I'm not. This is how you get to be good at stuff. This is how you get to get competent stuff. But also, if it's the case that people are mocking you or making fun of you or coming down at you for being at B, C, and D and you're not at Z, it's a reflection of them. Like, that's a problem. If you're looking at somebody very early on in the learning process and you're making fun of them, you're doing something wrong, right? You don't look at a child and say, well, you don't know calculus, you dumb fool. Like, no, of course the child doesn't know calculus. So the people that make fun of the children that don't understand calculus, their opinions aren't really worthwhile in the first place.
Right.